The year 1944 did not bring an end to the war for the Empire of Japan. It brought the grim, statistical certainty of defeat. The air battles of 1943 had been costly, but 1944 transformed cost into catastrophe. The loss rates of aircraft were no longer sustainable, they were existential. The great victories of the American advance, the brutal grind of island hopping toward the Japanese home islands, were facilitated by a single, unseen technological advantage, the variable time (VT) fuse. The ghost blossom had matured into the silent, ubiquitous harbinger of the end. The Imperial Navy's initial response, denial, doubling down on traditional fire control methods, and blaming pilot error, could no longer withstand the weight of reality. The reports flooding the Ministry of the Navy were unanimous. American flak was too precise, too instantaneous, too terrifyingly adaptive to be the product of synchronized timing fuses. It was an intelligence failure so profound that it threatened the very foundation of the empire's scientific credibility. This realization led, in a moment of desperate institutional paralysis, to the creation of the Fuse Analysis and Countermeasure Committee, FACC. The FACC was not a scientific think tank, it was a crisis management unit, sequestered deep beneath the rigid, bureaucratic labyrinth of the ministry in Tokyo. Its very existence was an admission of a catastrophic, 2-year-long scientific blind spot. The most telling sign of the empire's desperation was the leadership of the FACC, engineer Kenjiro Akizuki. A man previously marginalized and dismissed for his radical and proven theories regarding radio frequency proximity, Akizuki was now thrust into the role of savior. He represented the inconvenient truth that the established scientific hierarchy had deliberately suppressed. This promotion did not grant him power, it condemned him to a constant, draining intellectual battle with the remnants of the old guard. The shadow that loomed largest over Akizuki's bunker laboratory was that of Dr. Hiroshi Sato. Sato, though formally removed from his position as lead physicist, still wielded enormous power through a network of loyal, deeply entrenched protégés who occupied the FACC's key administrative and analytical positions. These men were products of the rigid imperial scientific system, steeped in deterministic mechanics and profoundly resistant to anything that challenged their worldview. They treated Akizuki not as a leader, but as a temporary, politically mandated aberration. The internal conflict within the FACC became a microcosm of the war itself, the battle between stubborn pride and uncomfortable truth. Sato's disciples continued to champion the strategy of jamming external American radar systems, clinging to the belief that the Americans had merely perfected the logistics of fire control. They would spend hours preparing complex, multi-layered schematics detailing proposed high-powered jamming transmitters, expensive, resource-draining devices that Akizuki knew would be utterly futile against an autonomous, internal projectile radar. "We are wasting precious material," Akizuki would argue, his voice strained with fatigue and frustration, addressing his skeptical committee. "If the energy required for detonation is contained within the shell, then no external jamming can prevent it. The target selection process is over the moment the shell is fired. We must focus on the G-force solution." The G-force solution was the crux of the entire technological chasm. The conventional wisdom, championed by Sato, held that the $20,000 G-forces, the astronomical pressure exerted upon the shell's components during the instant of firing, would inevitably destroy any fragile radio vacuum tube. To believe in the VT fuse was to believe that the Americans had achieved a massive, simultaneous breakthrough in both material science, creating ceramic/glass durable enough to survive the shock, and miniaturization, packing a working radar unit into the shell's nose. The Empire had failed at this exact hurdle years prior and had, therefore, declared it impossible. Akizuki understood that abstract theory would never satisfy the entrenched skeptics. He needed physical proof, the wreckage of the enemy's science. His only recourse was to launch the most perilous and secretive missions of the war, the technological scavenging operations. He petitioned the High Command for the use of small, fast naval vessels and discreet fishing trawlers, giving them a singular, terrifying directive: locate and recover an intact, unexploded American anti-aircraft shell. These were not missions of valor, they were missions of desperate forensics, operating in the hostile waters where American ships had just won decisive victories. The Japanese crews sent into the aftermath faced the constant, gnawing fear of the American counter-destruction protocol. The U.S. Navy, maintaining fanatical secrecy over the VT fuse, routinely shelled the battle area one last time with conventional explosives before departing, ensuring any unexploded duds were detonated or irrevocably destroyed. To sweep these waters was to invite certain destruction. The logbooks of the submarine crews tasked with this duty tell a chilling tale of existential fear, not of the enemy's direct fire, but of the possibility of retrieving a dud only to have the U.S. Navy return and destroy the evidence, and the retrieval vessel, moments later. 4 months, the missions returned with nothing but salt-crusted scrap and the grim reports of near misses. Each failed retrieval was a victory for Dr. Sato's lingering influence, further fueling the skepticism of the FACC members who demanded a return to the pragmatic pursuit of jamming technology. Akizuki, his face perpetually etched with fatigue, knew he was running out of time, resources, and institutional credibility. The integrity of the Empire's scientific future hinged on finding a single, damaged piece of enemy ordnance in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The pressure mounted as news arrived of the American buildup for the Marianas Campaign. The next great naval clash was imminent, and the IJN was preparing to send its fleet into battle armed only with blind faith and obsolete technology. Akizuki knew that the coming battle would either validate his terrifying predictions or end the Empire's ability to wage naval war forever. He needed the relic of truth before the next tide of destruction washed over them. The miracle occurred in late April 1944. A small patrol trawler, disguised and operating under cover of darkness near the Palau Islands, a region recently swept by American task forces, snagged a heavily fouled piece of metal in its nets. It was a section of a 5-inch shell casing, heavily corroded and crusted with barnacles and coral, but its overall structure, particularly the crucial nose section, remained largely intact. It was the relic Akizuki had risked so many lives to find. The fragment was rushed back to the FACC bunker in a lead-lined container, treated with the reverence and paranoia reserved for the most dangerous of secrets. The atmosphere in the lab was electric. Dr. Sato's former protégés, unable to openly scoff at the physical evidence, hovered silently, their expressions a mixture of professional curiosity and profound, defensive dread. Akizuki led the forensic examination personally. This was not the work of a physicist, but of an archaeologist and a surgeon. Using specialized solvents and delicate tools designed for watchmaking, he and his most trusted engineers spent nearly 3 continuous days meticulously cleaning and dismantling the corroded cavity where the fuse mechanism resided. The first crucial discovery was the absence of a discernible mechanical timing mechanism. The cavity was not filled with the familiar springs, gears, and adjustable dials of the Type 99 fuse. Instead, it held a hardened resin mass protecting shattered fragments of something wholly alien to Japanese ordnance design. The core of the discovery lay in 3 specific, microscopic components that Akizuki carefully isolated under a high-powered electron microscope. Shattered ceramic shells. These were not conventional glass. The fragments were of a high-density, fused ceramic composite design to be incredibly shock-resistant. Akizuki instantly recognized this material as the key to the G-force solution. The Americans had solved the material science problem first, the electronics followed. Quartz crystal fragment, a piece of highly purified, shock-mounted quartz crystal, essential for maintaining a stable oscillation frequency, the heartbeat of a radar system. Subminiature vacuum tube remnants, the most damning evidence. Akizuki recovered the crushed, tubular fragments of what were clearly custom-made, micro-sized vacuum tubes, containing tiny filaments and grids. These were the tiny transmitter and receiver components. They confirmed the enemy was not using some clever acoustic or magnetic system. They were using a complete, miniaturized, robust radio frequency radar. The findings were undeniable. Akizuki finally possessed the truth. The confrontation with the Sato loyalists was swift and brutal. Akizuki presented the evidence not as a theory, but as a forensic fact. He held up a schematic of his own design, a simple, elegant diagram showing the shell emitting a continuous radio beam, detecting the reflective echo from the aircraft's metal skin, and detonating when the wave strength reached a preset proximity threshold. We dismissed this as impossible because we failed to create a ceramic tube that could survive the initial blast, Akizuki stated, his voice quiet but devastating. The Americans solved the engineering problem first. This projectile is not aimed at a predicted point in space. It is aimed at the general vicinity, and it aims itself in the final moments. It is instantaneous, independent, and tireless. Our entire defensive strategy, built upon the delay and error inherent in timed fuses, is obsolete. The report that emerged from the FACC, now completely authored by Akizuki and vetted by a handful of reformed engineers, was titled, "The True Nature of the Ghost Blossom, Independent Radio Proximity Fusing and the Fatal Scientific Delay." It was a document of profound strategic importance and national humiliation. The High Command received the report just weeks before the launch of Operation A-Go, the defense of the Marianas. The realization hit them not as a scientific curiosity, but as a chilling strategic certainty. The technological war had been lost, not in 1944, but in 1942, when they chose denial over investigation. The 2 years wasted dismissing Akizuki's warnings had given the American industrial complex an insurmountable lead in deployment, production, and doctrine. The immediate implications were catastrophic. Air superiority forfeiture. Every Japanese aircraft flying against a VT-armed ship was a nearly guaranteed loss, negating the IJN's remaining pilot training and combat aircraft pool. Naval vulnerability. American ships were now shielded by an impenetrable, adaptive flak dome, allowing them to operate closer to Japanese island defenses for preparatory bombardments. No countermeasure ready. The earliest possible date for Japan to field a working equivalent, the proposed Type 5 radio fuse, was estimated at 18 months, contingent on massive, immediate industrial overhaul and the mastering of the new ceramic material science. The discovery was a Pyrrhic victory. Akizuki had won the intellectual battle, but the war was already marching to the cadence of the enemy's superior technology. The fleet was already on its way to meet its inevitable, technologically predetermined fate. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, fought under the shadow of Akizuki's grim report, was not a battle between two forces of equal strength. It was an execution. It would enter the annals of naval history by the humiliating moniker bestowed by the victors, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The term perfectly captured the technological imbalance that had been created by the VT fuse. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese fleet, ordered tactical changes based on Akizuki's findings. Pilots were instructed to fly at extreme high altitude to dissipate the radar signal, or utilize massed, low-level waves to overwhelm the American gunners. Both tactics proved disastrous. The high-altitude formations were easily spotted and intercepted by American fighters, who themselves were protected by the VT flak screen of their escort ships. The massed low-level attacks simply offered more, clearer targets for the instantaneous shell. The combat experience was one of utter, technological terror for the Japanese airmen. Unlike conventional flak, which resulted in scattered bursts that could be anticipated and dodged, the VT fuse created a continuous, lethal canopy. American gunners simply had to point the weapon in the general direction of the enemy. The shell did the rest. Eyewitness accounts spoke of planes erupting midair without warning, engulfed by a flash that seemed to blossom from nowhere. In a single day, the IJN lost over 300 aircraft and, more importantly, the overwhelming majority of its remaining elite, carrier-qualified pilots. The core of Japan's naval air power was utterly annihilated. The VT fuse had achieved what sheer volume of conventional fire could never have accomplished. It had dismantled an entire branch of the military in a matter of hours. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots who returned were broken, describing a feeling of fighting an enemy that was sentient, invisible, and malicious. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Najima, one of the few survivors, wrote in his diary, "We were not flying into gunfire, we were flying into a calculation. The enemy has weaponized prediction. Our courage is a stone against a wave of instantaneous, computerized death. This loss of morale, driven by the realization that their bravery was irrelevant against this new science, was a wound deeper than the loss of material. The final, bitter payment for the 2 years of denial was the forfeiture of strategic initiative. The Americans, confident that their air cover was impenetrable, could now deploy their carriers and battleships with unprecedented aggression. The ability of the Japanese to conduct effective air reconnaissance, attack, or even diversion was eliminated. The war became a slow, deliberate American grind, where naval supremacy was secured by technology, allowing the American industrial juggernaut to dictate the pace and location of every engagement. The strategic consequences were compounded as the VT fuse was transitioned from an anti-aircraft role to an anti-personnel role on the ground. Once the U.S. confirmed the technology had not fallen into German hands, the fuse was adapted for field artillery. This marked the ultimate escalation of the technological betrayal. Japanese soldiers entrenched on Iwo Jima and Okinawa soon faced a new, terrifying reality. Conventional artillery shells, which needed to hit the ground to be effective, allowed soldiers refuge in deep trenches, bunkers, and foxholes. The VT-fused shells, however, were timed to detonate perfectly 10 to 30 feet above the target area, airburst. This maximized the downward trajectory and spread of shrapnel, turning the trenches and foxholes into deadly traps. The safety of the ground was revoked. Entire companies could be decimated by a single barrage of airbursts. This final application underscored the total failure of the Japanese technical establishment. They had not only misjudged the enemy's ability to create the fuse, but they had fundamentally misjudged its potential applications. The very soil the Japanese were fighting to defend was turned against them by a weapon conceived in a science they chose to ignore. Dr. Hiroshi Sato, the once revered physicist, watched the reports from his reduced post, a man utterly ruined by the scale of his intellectual error. The empire had chosen to follow his rigid, mechanical logic, and in doing so, had walked directly into the future. The war was lost not because of a lack of courage, but because of a lack of humility, a failure to believe that the enemy could achieve what the empire deemed impossible. The tiny, silent circuit of the VT fuse became the greatest saboteur of the Imperial Japanese war effort.